reject the false choice.
We can't accept false choices.
False choice, the false choice. It's a false choice.
False choice. That seems to be Kamala Harris's favorite line, and people interpret it in vastly different ways, either to describe how she refuses to be put in a box or how she refuses to commit to any particular policy. It also tells you about her approach to criminal justice, between being tough on crime and being a reformer. And that's been the case since she began her career in public service. When Harris became the DA of San Francisco in 2004, tough on crime policy was popular around the country. Even Joe Biden, who was pivotal in getting the 1994 crime bill passed a decade earlier, carried his enthusiasm about cracking down into the 2000s.
Fewer police on the street preventing crime and protecting community means more crime. And it's as simple as that. It's not rocket science. We went through this whole debate during the 80s and 90s.
But Harris claims that in the 2000s, she didn't flex laws like 3 strikes. She said as DA, her policy was only to pursue a 3rd strike if the crime was serious or violent. And yet she remained proud that the felony conviction rate rose during her tenure.
When we're talking about serious and violent crime, lock them up. In San Francisco, in my office, we've increased the conviction rates for the DA's office to the highest they've been in just under 15 years.
But her attempt to brand smart on crime policy goes beyond those serious and violent crimes. According to Mercury News, she had more convictions on marijuana charges than her predecessor. But she rarely put them in jail, preferring to send them to programs like her Back on Track initiative.
This is when there was a tough on crime mentality, and I created one of the first in the nation initiatives that was focused on re-entering former offenders by getting them jobs and training and counseling.
Her anti-truancy policy was the one that really turned some heads, threatening to charge parents if their children miss school.
I decided I was going to start prosecuting parents for truancy. Well, this was a little controversial in San Francisco. And frankly, my staff went bananas. They were very concerned. As a prosecutor and law enforcement, I have a huge stick. The school district has got a carrot. Let's work in tandem around our collective objective and goal, which is to get those kids in school.
She was elected California's Attorney General in 2011, and she expanded that program. Years later, she said this about the unintended consequences.
My regret is that I have now heard stories that where in some jurisdictions, DAs have criminalized the parents.
Right.
And I regret that that has happened.
In 2015, she required that police in the Justice Department wear body cameras, but refused to make them mandatory statewide. She created a first-of-its-kind database of deaths in police custody.
Why did I do that? Because I knew too often folks are talking anecdotally about what's wrong with the system and have not been given the data or try to claw it out of the system. And I said, nope, we're going to open this up.
But she declined to back a bill that would have required her office to investigate police shootings. By the time Harris became a senator in 2017, she became more vocal about progressive policies. She sponsored a bill that would decriminalize marijuana federally. But 9 years prior, she wrote an opposition argument against legalizing marijuana at the state level as San Francisco's district attorney, saying the measure, quote, seriously compromises the safety of our communities, roadways, and workplaces. As a senator, she also touted her efforts to end the cash bail system.
The only difference between someone being in jail pre-trial or being out is if they can afford to write a check.
When running for president, Harris outlined her desire to reform the criminal justice system, proposing ending mandatory minimum sentences on the federal level and encouraging independent investigations of officer-involved shootings. As the Biden campaign eyed her for the VP pick, protests over George Floyd and racial injustice were escalating, and she said this about defunding the police.
In many cities in America, over 1/3 of their city budget goes to police. What about the money going to social services? What about the money going to helping people with job training? What about helping with the mental health issues that communities are being plagued with, for which we're putting no resources?
Since she was chosen as Biden's running mate, the Trump administration has billed Harris as a, quote, radical, something those on the left dismiss, and they point to her record as a prosecutor as evidence. But now you know the facts.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.